Aliens set a perfect trap for the weak, forgot to check what planet answered. The distress signal had been playing for 4 hours before anyone on the flagship bothered to check whether it was real. Supreme Legate Varath On stood at the center of his command deck and watched the 19 human colony ships drop out of FTL one by one. They came in tight, trusting formation, the kind of spacing that said the pilots believed they were flying toward rescue. The seamless obsidian bulkheads around him hummed low and constant, threaded with the telemetry of 88 subject species, and Varath On let that hum settle into him the way it always did before a clean piece of work. The ships were slow. Passenger-grade drives, civilian registration, hull numbers that matched Earth's colonial transport register. 19 of them, carrying, by the sovereignty's own census projection, somewhere near 94,000 souls. That number would matter, he knew it already. Interdiction wings, he said. He did not raise his voice, he never needed to, close the corridor. It took 11 minutes. The human ships tried to correct course at minute 9, a clumsy too-late scatter that the interdiction field absorbed without effort. At minute 11, all 19 vessels sat motionless inside the sovereignty's containment grid, their distress beacons still broadcasting the fake hull breach signal that had drawn them here. They were answering a call for help that had never existed. "Open the diplomatic channel," On said. "Commerce Council full broadcast." The panoramic display above the command deck lit with the faces of 24 species. Council observers from the inner systems logging this for the record. On took a slow breath. He liked this part. "Colleagues," he said in the unhurried register of a man with nowhere pressing to be, "what you are witnessing is a demonstration. The human species has been granted observer status in this chamber for 11 years. In 11 years, they have answered 342 distress calls across the outer rim, every call, without exception." He let the number land. "This is a known behavioral pattern. We have now confirmed that it extends even into contested corridor space." He gestured toward the frozen transport ships on the display. "The species that answers every call for help is easy to catch. Consider this a demonstration of the cost of sentiment." The broadcast logged it verbatim, that was the point. Then he filed the ultimatum. "The part that has me thinking still is what happened in the next 18 hours. Stay close." 72 hours. That was the window Varath On gave Earth to surrender territorial rights to the full border corridor, 11 systems, 4 inhabited moons and the deep void freight lanes that fed half their outer colonies. Total concession, no negotiation. The 94,000 civilians held at Relay Station Dho Anna would be reclassified as unlicensed sub-tier labor upon deadline if the terms were not met. He returned to his command desk and opened the intelligence file. It was 31 years old, he knew that. His analyst had flagged it twice in the past decade, requesting a fresh survey, and both times he had declined. The file was thorough. Earth's FTL drive specifications were on page 4. Their military command protocols were on page 9. Their treaty obligations, specifically Article 17 of the Compact of Keth, the one that barred Earth from deploying autonomous navigational systems within sovereignty-adjacent space, were on page 22. He read the relevant sections the way a builder reads a foundation, not to learn something new, but to confirm the ground was solid. Earth's fastest warships would need a minimum of 91 hours to bridge the distance to Dho Anna. The 72-hour window was not cruelty, it was geometry. He set the file on the edge of his desk, physical and grease-worn at the corners from years of handling. A document that old had a certain weight to it. He liked that too. His calm officer spoke without turning. "Legate, no response from Earth yet." "No," On said, "there won't be." 18 hours passed, then 20, then 22. The Commerce Council observers sent 3 separate queries to Earth's diplomatic relay. Standard acknowledgement requests, the kind any species filed within the first 6 hours of receiving an ultimatum, even if only to confirm receipt. Nothing came back. On the flagship, the junior officers began to relax. The silence read to them the way silence usually read, as the sound of a species sitting with the weight of a loss it could not reverse. Varath On heard his tactical officer say quietly to the navigation crew that the humans were probably in emergency session right now, trying to decide how to frame total surrender as something other than what it was. On said nothing to correct him. The man wasn't wrong, he had simply stated it too kindly. The truth, as On understood it, was plainer. Earth was not in session. Earth was doing what species in this position always did. They were calculating the math, finding it insurmountable, and beginning the slow process of accepting that the things they loved were no longer theirs to protect. The 94,000 would be processed, the corridor would pass to sovereignty administration, and Earth would be, at the end of this, a smaller thing than it had been at the start. That was how the geometry worked. He turned back to his display and began drafting the formal sub-tier labor intake schedule for Dho Anna. Administrative work, but he preferred doing it himself. The details mattered. The logistics office had no windows. That was the first thing Kato Ren always noticed about it, not because it bothered him, but because it didn't. After 4 years of working here, the absence of natural light had stopped registering. The office sat 11 meters below a commercial cargo processing hub outside Accra, in a corridor that the building schematic listed as a secondary ventilation access route. The floor was unfinished concrete. 3 of the overhead panels flickered if you ran too many processes at once. The coffee machine in the corner had been broken for 8 months, and no one had filed a replacement request, because filing a replacement request would have meant formally documenting that this office existed. Director Amara Osai was already at her console when Ren arrived at hour 19. She had a mug of something warm that was not coffee. He could smell the dried ginger from across the room, and she was reading. Not a tactical display, a standard shipping manifest for a bulk freight run from the outer colony at Vila Station. She looked like someone reviewing cargo weight discrepancies on an ordinary Tuesday. Ren set his bag down. I saw the council broadcast. I know, Osai said. She did not look up from the manifest. 94,000 people. I know that too. She turned a page. The manifest was physical, printed on actual paper, the kind she had used since before Ren joined this office, because paper did not log access timestamps and it could not be remotely read. How long has Ren been watching the feed? About 2 hours. He pulled out his chair. I wanted to understand what we were working with. We've known what we were working with for 9 years, Osai said. The situation is the same, only the timeline has shortened. She set the manifest aside, flat on the desk, and reached for her mug. She took one slow sip, then set it back down with the same precision she used for everything, not careful exactly, just exact. She turned to the console. Ren watched her hands. Run the handshake diagnostic, she said. All active nodes, I want a confirmation count. Ren pulled up the routing interface. The screen filled with a column of amber status markers, 214 of them, stacked in geographic order from the inner relay points outward to the deep corridor stations. He had looked at this list so many times in the past 9 years that he knew the node sequence by memory. He ran the diagnostic. 2 minutes and 40 seconds later, every marker turned green. 214, he said. Osai looked at the number. Her expression did not change. Good, she said, and went back to the manifest. That was all. Ren found, for reasons he couldn't fully account for, that this was the most frightening thing he had seen all day. More frightening than the broadcast. More frightening than the number 94,000 spoken aloud in Varathan's flat professor voice. He turned back to his own display and did not say anything else because there was nothing useful to say, and Osai's office had a quality to it, always had, of being a place where only useful things were said. The overhead panel above the coffee machine flickered once and went still. Outside, 23 hours of silence continued to radiate outward from Earth. In every direction the sovereignty was monitoring. On the flagship, one of the junior navigation officers asked his superior, around hour 24, whether anyone had run a check on the compact of Keth's commercial amendments. The superior looked up from his display. What amendments? The junior officer pulled up a reference file. There's a footnote, page 38 of the original ratification. A logistical exemption added during the commercial expansion review. It's about automated freight routing systems. I flagged it during the standard treaty audit last quarter. It wasn't forwarded to the legate. The superior looked at the screen for a long moment. The footnote was small. The language was dense. The kind of dense that comes from lawyers who did not want the language read too closely. He closed the file. It's a commercial freight provision, he said. File it under standard review. We're not running cargo. The junior officer nodded and went back to his work. The file stayed closed. Osai read the freight manifest all the way through. It took her 40 minutes. Ren had watched her do this before, not skim, not flag sections, but actually read every line of a document that most people in her position would have handed to an algorithm. She said once that algorithms were good at finding what you were looking for and bad at finding what you weren't. He had not asked her to explain that further. When she finished, she turned the last page face down on the stack and picked up a second document. This one was thinner, 3 pages handwritten in 2 colors of ink with margin notes that Ren had never been able to fully read from across the room. He knew what it was. She had been writing in it on and off for 9 years. Ren, she said without looking up, tell me what you know about the Kurath relay architecture. He thought about how to answer that. Standard carrier-grade mesh. Each station handles local traffic and passes long-range vectors through a common handshake protocol. The handshake is proprietary, but the underlying structure is based on the old Meridian Freight standard, the one they adopted from human commercial navigation back when they were still buying our cargo licenses. Before they stopped needing to, Osai said. Before they stopped needing to. She made a small mark in the margin of her document. and if you wanted to run a foreign instruction set through that handshake without triggering the intrusion filters. Ren had thought about this question for 4 years. He had not known he was thinking about it for the first 3. You'd have to make the instruction look like a routing update, something the system already expected to receive, something so ordinary the filters wouldn't bother comparing it to a threat signature. He paused. You'd have to get into the traffic first, commercial traffic, the kind that moves through every station without logging an inspection request. Osai nodded once. She closed the handwritten document and slid it into a drawer. We bought 312 freight waypoints between year 1 and year 3, she said. Not routes, waypoints, the individual coordinate nodes that carrier-grade ships use to orient their FTL jumps at each relay. They're updated on a 14-day maintenance cycle. Every update carries a small navigational module. Ours carried a little more than the standard module. She looked at the console. We've been updating them for 9 years. Ren did the math without moving. 9 years of 14-day cycles across 312 waypoints, touching every relay station in the Sovereignty's jump network. He had known in a general way what Stillwater was. He understood now in a specific way what 9 years actually meant. The modules don't do anything, Osai said. That's the important part. They sit inside the relay architecture and they run a diagnostic loop, one that looks to any audit like routine navigational calibration. They've been audited 14 times. They passed 14 times. She picked up her mug. They do nothing until they receive a specific handshake from a specific frequency, a commercial freight frequency, the kind that doesn't go through military channels. The word Stillwater, Ren said. A standard cargo status confirmation, Osai said, used by about 40,000 freight operators, means the shipment is on schedule and undisturbed. She drank. We chose it in year 2. It took 4 months to get the wording past the legal review for our first waypoint purchase contract. Ren looked at the column of green markers on his display, 214, and the relay stations. The waypoints are in the stations, Osai said. They always were. The Sovereignty's freight infrastructure had been built on human commercial navigation standards in the 3rd century of their expansion. It was a fact that appeared in no official Sovereignty record. It had been quietly excised from the administrative history during the reclassification of subject species contributions, but the underlying protocol structure was still there if you knew what you were reading. The Meridian Freight Standard, a human-built open-source routing language, licensed freely across the Outer Rim in the early years of Earth's commercial expansion, before the Sovereignty decided that licensing implied equality and stopped accepting Earth's trade applications. They had kept the protocol, they had simply stopped crediting it. Osai had found it in year 1, a footnote in a decommissioned cargo license agreement, the kind that sat in a sealed filing archive in a basement in Rotterdam under a category label that translated roughly to superseded commercial frameworks. She had read it on a Tuesday afternoon in a building that smelled of old paper and recycled heating air, and she had sat with what it meant for a long time before she wrote the first entry in the handwritten document. The Sovereignty had built 214 jump relay stations on top of a routing language they had taken from a species they considered legally primitive. Every update cycle, every maintenance ping, every routine diagnostic passed through a protocol that had been written by humans and never fully replaced, because replacing it would have meant admitting it was there. They could not use what they didn't know they were using. Ren said at hour 26, who knows about this? In this building, Osai said, you and I. Outside this building. She thought about it for a moment, genuinely considered the question not as a formality. 3 people approved the original black budget allocation in year 1. 2 of them are dead. The 3rd is retired and has not been briefed on the current status. She paused. The shell companies that held the waypoint contracts are 7 layers deep and were dissolved after each purchase cycle. The legal review teams never saw the same contract twice. Another pause. The freight operators who carried our updates didn't know what they were carrying. They still don't. Ren nodded slowly. So if something goes wrong, nothing in this office leads anywhere, Osai said. That was the cost, not the money. The money was trillions, but money leaves traces that can be denied. The cost was that no one can come in and help us if this doesn't work. She set her mug down. We are the entirety of this operation. The overhead panel above the coffee machine flickered again. Neither of them looked at it. It will work, Ren said, not a question. The diagnostic confirmed 214 active nodes, Osai said. It works right now in this moment, whether we use it or not. She pulled the freight manifest back toward her and opened it to page 1. What it does in the next 46 hours depends on what Legate On decides to do. On the Sovereignty flagship at hour 27, Varath On ate a meal at his command desk. This was not unusual for him. He preferred working through meal periods rather than observing the fleet's formal dining rotation. His aide brought him the standard senior officer ration, pressed grain, a protein compound, and a cup of the pale mineral-infused water that the sovereignty's nutritional doctrine recommended for long command deployments. He ate without tasting it, reading the latest Commerce Council acknowledgement logs. The Council had received 2 inquiries from Outer Rim observers asking when Earth's formal response was expected. He had the Comm Center send a standard holding notice, negotiations ongoing, update to follow. That was the word he used, negotiations. It was accurate in the sense that one side of a negotiation could be entirely silent. He turned to the intelligence file again. The edges of the physical document were soft with handling. He opened it to page 22, the treaty section, and read the relevant clause for the 3rd time in 2 days. Article 17, Autonomous Navigational Systems. The restriction was clear. Earth had signed it 31 years ago, at a point when their FTL infrastructure was too underdeveloped to make the clause meaningful, and the clause had remained in force through 3 subsequent commercial expansion reviews without amendment. He closed the file. In his experience, species that had agreed to something 31 years ago at a moment of relative weakness did not quietly undo it. They petitioned, they appealed, they brought it to the Council. They did not simply act as though the clause didn't exist, because acting as though a clause didn't exist while 31 years of settlement history said otherwise was an extraordinary claim, the kind that required extraordinary capability to back up. Earth had been granted observer status in the Commerce Council. They traded in agricultural exports and manufactured goods and passenger transport licenses. Their defense posture was consistent with a species that had never lost a conflict badly enough to build a serious wartime doctrine. He was not worried about Article 17. He did not think about the footnote on page 38. At hour 31, Osai said, Ren pulled a full roster. He knew which roster she meant. He had been maintaining it for 2 years, updating it on a monthly cycle against the Commercial Passenger Registry. He pulled it up. 94,000 names. A column that went on long past what a screen could hold, sorted by vessel assignment and then by age. He had put the ages in because Os had asked him to 18 months ago when the roster was first assembled. She had not explained why. He understood now that she hadn't needed to. He scrolled down slowly. The youngest name on the roster was a child who had been 11 months old when the first colonial transport left. She was 9 now. Generate the audio file, Osai said. Ren looked at her, all of them. Every name, age, and vessel assignment after each one. She was looking at the column of green markers. Used the standard freight log voice, unhurried, the way you'd read a cargo manifest. He ran the generation. It took 4 minutes. When it finished, a file sat in the queue, 43 megabytes, which was not very large, and which would run for 11 minutes at the specified pace. Ren looked at the file. He looked at the column of 214 green markers. He looked at Osai. When An hears his name read back to him, she said, as though continuing a thought she had been having privately, he won't be the one who set a trap, he'll be the one who counted people. She turned back to the console. That distinction matters. She did not explain further. Ren did not ask. The file sat in the queue. The green markers sat at 214. Somewhere beyond the ceiling of the logistics office, past the concrete and the cargo processing hub and the open sky above Accra, 46 hours remained on Vareth On's countdown. Osai reached for her mug, found it empty and set it back down. Outside this room, in every direction, the silence from Earth continued, and somewhere inside the Sovereignty's network, inside every relay station that touched the 6-millennium-old Empire's jump infrastructure, 312 pieces of a 9-year-old plan sat perfectly still, waiting. At hour 36, Osai picked up a pen and drew a single line through the last entry in the handwritten document. Then she opened the freight console, typed 11 characters into the cargo status field of an outbound waypoint update, routed through a bulk carrier registered in the name of a company that had not legally existed for 6 years, and pressed send. The word was Stillwater. It left the office the same way 40,000 other cargo confirmations left their origin points every hour, unremarkable, unlogged as anything other than routine, moving at light speed through the civilian freight relay network. Ren watched the transmission queue clear. He watched the timestamp register. He watched the outbound marker turn gray, which meant delivered. Nothing changed on their end. On Vareth On's end, everything did. The tactical display on the Sovereignty flagship had been showing the same clean readout for 36 hours. On was reviewing the Commerce Council's updated observer log when the main grid turned gray. Not dimmed, not flickered. Gray, a flat, dead color that the display had never shown in 12 years of service, because gray meant the system had stopped receiving positional data entirely and had defaulted to a null state rather than show corrupted information. He looked at it for exactly 3 seconds before calling for a status report. His navigation officer was already running checks. Jump vector data is unavailable, Legate. Relays are not responding to administrative queries. Which relay? The navigation officer's hands moved fast across his console, then they stopped, all of them. On stood up. All of them was not a phrase that fit inside any operational framework he had. All of them meant every jump relay station in the sovereignty, not a sector failure, not a cascade event from a damaged node, but a simultaneous administrative lockout across a network that had never failed in 300 years of continuous operation. The network that carried every ship's exit vector. The network that the entire sovereignty moved through. He crossed to the navigation station himself and looked at the officer's display. 214 relay points, each showing the same status: administrative access rejected, external override detected, sovereignty credentials not recognized. He read that last line twice. "Get me the relay operations center," he said. The calm officer patched through in seconds. The voice that came back was tight. "Legate, we are seeing a full network administrative rejection. An external credential set has assumed ownership of the routing layer. We cannot identify the source protocol. It does not match any known system architecture in our registry. Can you override it?" A pause. "We have been trying for 4 minutes. The system accepts our inputs and routes them back out without processing. It's not blocking us, it's redirecting us. Whatever is running this network is not shutting us out. It's simply not recognizing our authority as primary." On looked at the gray display. Somewhere in the back of his mind, a number arranged itself. The total number of ships currently in transit through sovereignty space mid-jump without exit vectors locked. He did not say the number out loud. "Find the source protocol," he said. His voice was level. "And get me a calm line to the flagship's encrypted command channel." Legate, the calm officer turned from his station. His upper crest had gone flat, the involuntary response in his species to something the body understood before the mind caught up. "The command channel is already occupied." The voice that came through the encrypted command frequency was unhurried. It did not announce itself. It did not issue a demand or a declaration. It simply began. Kofi Asant Mensah, age 47, colonist, assigned to Hull ESV crossing of rivers. A pause, precisely the length of the pause between items on a cargo manifest. Priya Venkatson, age 34, colonist, assigned to Hull ESV crossing of rivers. On stood at the center of his command deck and listened. Around him, his officers had stopped working. Not because of any order, there had been no order, but because the sound filling the bridge was not something that left room for other actions. It was a list, a complete, meticulous list, read in the voice of a system that had no urgency about finishing because it had already decided it would. The list had 94,000 entries. Every name, every age, every vessel. The voice did not rush. It did not editorialize. It read as cleanly as a manifest, which was exactly what it was. On's chief tactical officer tried twice to cut the channel. The command did not process. The comm panel accepted the input, as the relay operations center had said, and routed it back out without result. The channel could not be closed from this end. That was not something that was supposed to be possible on an encrypted command frequency. On pulled the intelligence file from his desk. He opened it to page 38. He had not opened this page before. It was the commercial supplements section, the annexes that had been added during the treaty's ratification review, the kind of language that existed in every document of this age as a record of procedural thoroughness rather than practical significance. He had read pages 1 through 37. He had read page 22 many times. He had not read page 38 because commercial freight exemptions were not the section of a treaty that a supreme legate of an interdiction wing typically needed. The footnote was at the bottom of the page. It was 4 sentences long. He read it once, he read it again. In the background, the voice on the command channel had reached a name he didn't know, age 12, Hull ESV passage of return, and was moving on to the next. The footnote said, in the flat administrative language of a document drafted 31 years ago, that autonomous navigational routing systems operating within established commercial freight infrastructure were exempt from the restrictions of Article 17, provided the systems were embedded within standard carrier-grade waypoint modules and had completed a minimum of 12 continuous update cycles without triggering an intrusion response. He looked at the relay status display, 214 stations. He thought about 12 update cycles on a 14-day maintenance schedule. He thought about what that math produced and what it would have taken to arrange, and how long it would have taken to arrange it without anyone noticing, and what kind of organization built a thing like that without filing a single appeal to the Commerce Council or a single military communique or a single diplomatic note in 9 years of preparation. He thought about the 342 distress calls. For the first time in 37 years of command, Varathon understood that he had misread something completely. The list ran for 11 minutes. On stayed standing for all of it. His officers did not speak. The Relay Operations Center did not call back with good news. The grey tactical display did not change. At minute 8, his chief tactical officer said very quietly, "Legate, our ship's in transit, they have no exit vectors." He paused. "If the relays don't come back online, they cannot complete their jumps." On said nothing. At minute 10, his navigation officer said, "We've identified the protocol source. She stopped. She looked at her display for a moment as though waiting for it to correct itself. "It's the Meridian Freight Standard, the commercial routing language she stopped again. "That we adopted," On said. "Yes, that we adopted from the human commercial license agreements in the 3rd century of expansion." "Yes, Legate." No one said anything after that. The voice on the command channel reached the final name on the list. It read it with the same pace it had used for the first, then it stopped. The command channel stayed open. In the silence that followed, 11 minutes of names, and then this, Varathon looked at the grey display and understood, with the specific precision of a man who had built his career on reading situations accurately, that he had been operating on the assumption that the thing he did not understand could not understand him back. He had been wrong about that. There were 94,000 names on that list, and when the last one finished, he still didn't know what came next. Neither did his empire. 3 seconds after the list ended, the command channel opened to a voice that was not recorded. It was live. Director Osa had a handwritten document open on the desk in front of her. She had not prepared a script. The document held 4 words: names, stations, terms, done. She looked at the first word and drew a line through it. She looked at the second and did the same. Then she looked at the third. Kato Ren watched her from across the room. He had not moved in 11 minutes. "Legate on," Osai said. Her voice came through the flagship's encrypted command channel without distortion. It was the same voice that had read the names, or rather it was the voice behind it, the one that had decided 9 years ago what the list would contain and when it would be read. "I want to make sure you have everything you need to understand your situation before I tell you what happens next." She paused. A short pause, not for effect. She was genuinely giving him a moment to settle. "You have 214 relay stations that will not respond to your credentials. You have ships in transit without exit vectors. You have a commercial routing layer that your own infrastructure depends on, which is currently operating under a different administration." Another pause. "We aren't setting a course for your fleet, Legate. We're simply confirming you no longer have one." On had not sat down. He was looking at the grey display. "The terms," Osai said, "are 3. The 94,000 citizens will be dispatched to the coordinate grid I am transmitting now within 48 hours. The Sovereignty will upload a certified retraction of all territorial demands to the Commerce Council by the same mark. Upon receipt of both, Stillwater will return to passive dormancy." She let that sit for one breath. "You will never know which stations still carry it. That is the entirety of our terms." The channel stayed open for a moment after she finished. Not because she had more to say, she didn't, but because she was giving him room to respond if he chose to. He did not respond. She drew a line through the 3rd word in her document, then she looked at the 4th. "Done." Not yet, but the handwritten words sat there, waiting to be true, in the same calm way the green markers had sat at 214. On the flagship, Varathon looked at the physical treaty document on his desk, the grease-stained edges, the soft corners, 31 years of handling. He had brought it to this command as proof of a legal certainty, proof of a geometry, proof that the species which answered every distress call had no instrument capable of answering this one. Page 38 faced up. He did not close it. The 48 hours passed the way administrative periods always did, in increments, logged without commentary. At hour 11, the Sovereignty's Commerce Council submitted a formal notification of territorial demand, withdrawal to the Outer Rim Observer Relay. The language was procedural. It cited operational reconsideration and did not explain further. No one at the council asked it to. At hour 31, the transport convoy departed relay station Dho Anna on the coordinate grid Osa had transmitted. 19 ships, the same ones that had answered the false distress call, now carrying every person the Sovereignty had processed into sub-tier intake. Their transponders broadcast civilian registry codes. Their drives ran at passenger-grade speed. They were slow and trusting, and they arrived at the border waypoint at hour 46 without incident. The youngest name on the roster, a child who had been 9 years old when the ultimatum was filed, was asleep when the transport crossed the threshold. Her parents were not. They stood in the corridor outside the cabin door and did not speak. There was nothing that needed saying at that particular moment. And the corridor was the kind of corridor where silence felt correct. Kato Ren logged the convoy's arrival at 04:38 local time, Accra. He made the entry by hand, in the same font the office used for cargo confirmation. Then he sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a while. Osai was already drafting the dormancy signal when he turned back to his console. She had the handwritten document open beside her, 4 words, 3 of them already struck through, and she was writing the transmission by hand before typing it, the way she wrote everything that mattered. Same frequency, Ren asked. Same frequency, she said. Same cargo status phrasing, the system will recognize it. The word she used was not Stillwater. The dormancy signal was a different phrase, one chosen in Year 3 for Year 9 on the assumption that the dormancy would be the part that required the most precision. Stillwater had been the activation. This was something else. A word that meant, in the freight lexicon of 40,000 operators who would never know it, carried 2 meanings. Shipment complete, no further action required. She typed it, she sent it. On Ren's display, the 214 green markers did not turn gray. They did not change color at all. They stayed green because the nodes were still there, still embedded in the routing layer of every relay station in the Sovereignty's jump network, still running their diagnostic loops, still passing every audit they would ever be asked to pass. Dormancy was not removal. Osai had been precise about that in the terms, and she had been precise about it deliberately. You will never know which stations still carry it. The markers sat at 214. Ren looked at them for a long time. In the weeks that followed, the Commerce Council convened 3 working sessions on what its members were calling, informal session language, the navigational infrastructure incident. The term had been agreed upon in the first session, after 2 hours of discussion about what to call something that had no precedent in 3 centuries of sovereignty operation. The third session produced a draft protocol for rescue vessel identification, a formal mechanism, 3 articles long, that would theoretically prevent a distress beacon from being used as a lure for civilian transport ships. The draft was submitted to the Outer Rim Observer Registry for comment. Earth's observer delegation read it and sent back a 1-paragraph acknowledgement. The paragraph noted receipt, confirmed the delegation's availability for further discussion, and thanked the Council for its attention to the matter. It did not say anything else. The delegation did not ask for the draft to be strengthened. They did not ask for enforcement provisions. They did not ask for anything. This was noted by every species represented in that session, and discussed afterward in at least 9 separate closed briefings, and written into 4 separate intelligence summaries for 4 separate governments. The summaries used different language but reached the same conclusion, that a species which had spent 9 years building something it never needed to mention, and then used it once and said nothing further, was a species that had communicated everything it needed to communicate. Varath An was relieved of his command 22 days after the convoy crossed the border. The official record cited operational assessment. He returned to his home system and was not given a new posting. He took the physical treaty document with him. He was permitted to do this because it was his personal copy. He had purchased it from the archive 20 years ago at the start of his career, because he believed a supreme legate should hold the source material in his hands. He kept it in his office at home, in a desk drawer that he did not open for a long time. When he finally did, he did not open it to page 22. The logistics office below the cargo hub in Accra stayed exactly as it was. The floor remained unfinished concrete. The overhead panel above the coffee machine continued its intermittent flicker. The coffee machine itself was not repaired. No replacement request was filed, because filing a replacement request would have meant formally documenting that the office existed, and that policy had been in place for 9 years and was not revised. Osai filed 1 document in the final administrative period, a routine waypoint maintenance confirmation, submitted through a shell company that had been dissolved 7 years ago and existed now only as a routing identifier in a freight network that no one except Ren had ever fully mapped. The document confirmed that 312 commercial waypoints remained active and current. Maintenance cycle, ongoing, status, standard. It was the most accurate thing she had filed in 9 years. She drew a line through the 4th word in the handwritten document. Done. She closed it and put it in the desk drawer. Then she picked up her mug, found it still empty from the night before, and set it back down with the same precision she used for everything. Ren had pulled up a new routing manifest on his console. He was already reading it. The 214 green markers sat in their column on the display, unchanged, unhurried, the way something sits when it has no reason to move and no interest in announcing that it isn't moving. They would sit there tomorrow. They would sit there next year. They would pass the next audit and the one after that, running their diagnostic loops in the same relay stations that had rejected sovereignty credentials on a Tuesday morning, and then simply continued to operate. Nobody who answered a distress call in the Outer Rim after that ever answered one alone. The record showed it 343 calls, and then 344, the number climbing with the same patience the green markers maintained. Each one answered, each one logged. Not sentiment, not habit. They answered the distress call because they were already in a position to do so. The distress call was not the vulnerability. The distress call was the invitation.